Let me know if there's any issues with my volume or any of the volumes during the presentations. But we will get started. So good afternoon. My name is John Reagans. I'm the statewide planning manager here at ADWR. I'm joined here today by Natalie Mass, active management area director, who will be presenting items 2 and 3 on the agenda you see on the next screen. So there's today's agenda. My team in statewide planning will be collaborating with the AMA team, among other programs here at ADWR, on this new supply and demand assessment, and we are excited to get things started. Once we've completed the presentations you see on the screen, we will have plenty of time today to help answer any questions you may have. So I will now hand things off to Kevin Lane. Kevin is the supply and demand team's new stakeholder engagement coordinator, and he will walk you through the meeting logistics. Kevin?
Hello, everyone. Since this meeting is a hybrid meeting, we have a few changes to our meeting logistics. For those attending virtually or over the phone, mute yourself when not speaking. Indicate you wish to speak by typing your name in the chat box, and you will be invited to unmute and speak. Please message everyone in the chat so that we can see you, and please state your name when speaking. For those of you here in person today, hold all questions until the end of the presentation. Raise your hand if you wish to speak, and staff will bring you a microphone when it's your turn. Speak into the microphone and state your name when speaking as well. This meeting and the chat will be recorded. If you have any technical issues, you can send a direct message to the ADWR host in the chat or call the ADWR help desk at 602-771-8444 or email to tickets@azwater.gov. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So I will start things off today by providing a little background on Senate Bill 1740. Senate Bill 1740 was one of the last acts signed into law during the last legislative session, and it expands the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority, or WIFA, while also including a new provision requiring ADWR to conduct the supply and demand assessment for each groundwater basin in Arizona. And the quote you see on the screen is from ADWR Director Tom Bishotsky during the signing of Senate Bill 1740. Slide, please. So as I mentioned previously, SB 1740 was one of the final acts signed into law from last session and represents a major investment in Arizona's future. This new approach gives Arizona flexibility to pursue a variety of water solutions. This was also done in companion with the state budget appropriating over $1 billion to WIFA. The restructured Water Infrastructure Finance Authority would not only continue to fund projects within Arizona to develop more water and wastewater infrastructure, but pursue projects to bring new water supplies into the state, as well as funding projects within Arizona to increase conservation. These additional responsibilities will be addressed by the new WIFA board structure, appointed jointly by the legislature and the governor. Funding includes the new long-term water augmentation fund, water supply development revolving fund, and the new water conservation grant fund, which that grant fund includes $200 million for the initial grant program. Slide, please. The graphic you see on the screen illustrates the department's view of how the new WIFA board would be structured as the bill was being developed. As I noted on the last slide, WIFA will continue to fund the design and construction of water and wastewater infrastructure projects, but will now have new duties to pursue augmentation and conservation projects with a new board structure. As you see on the slide, those appointments are made jointly by the state legislature and the governor. And for reference, the text noting large and small that you see on this graphic refers to the appointment of members from large and small counties based on size of population, greater than 400,000 and less than 400,000. The board membership and advisory member criteria are defined in this new legislation. Slide, please. For the purpose of this meeting, we will focus on the provision of SB 1740, which requires ADWR to conduct a rolling 5-year supply and demand assessment of each groundwater basin in the state. This is the new provision in Title 45 of, of the Arizona Revised Statutes that requires ADWR to analyze and prepare a water supply and demand assessment for at least 6 of the groundwater basins every year, with all the basins having a supply and demand assessment completed once every 5 years. The first assessment will be due December 1st of 2023 and December 1st of each year thereafter. This supply and demand assessment will include the groundwater basins of the state's active management areas, along with every groundwater basin outside of the state's 6 AMAs, Douglas Basin AMA being the newest AMA in the state. Next slide, please. The provision you see on the screen is from the new legislation defining the evaluation criteria for projects from the Long-Term Water Augmentation Fund, which is a newly established fund that can be used to fund water augmentation projects. The section shown here, section 14 of the statute, is just one of several criteria that the board shall consider. It is also important to note that ADWR does not view the supply and demand assessment as restricting the WIFA boards from being able to approve projects in the basins that have yet to be analyzed by the department in accordance with this new legislation. Section 14 is highlighted, because it states that WIFA, I'm gonna get a drink of water here. Sorry about that. It states that WIFA shall consider the information contained in the supply and demand assessment conducted by ADWR pursuant to ARS 45-105, which is the new provision defining the supply and demand assessment. Slide, please. So Senate Bill 1740 was signed into law last July, and our teams at ADWR have been working diligently to prepare for the new requirements of the supply and demand assessment. This includes hiring and training new staff to the supply and demand team. Research is underway as we develop our initial data sets, develop initial assumptions, and begin our analysis of each groundwater basin included in the assessment. We will head into calendar year 2023, which is now only weeks away, with our supply and demand assessment already underway. Assessments will be due on December 1st of each year, starting next year in 2023. And as you see from the groundwater basin map on the screen, with 51 groundwater basins in the state and over 114,000 square miles, there is a lot of work ahead. So I will now turn things over to Natalie, who will go over the groundwater basins, data and methods portion of the meeting. Natalie?
Thanks, John. All right, like John said, my name is Natalie Mast. I am the Active Management Areas Director responsible for planning here at ADWR. And without further bearing the lead or any further delay, we're going to announce the basins that we are going to be analyzing for 2023. Next slide, please. There we go. I'll talk a little bit about each of these basins in this section of the presentation, but the common theme you're going to see here is that all of these basins have been very visible in our water discussions in recent years. We've grouped them geographically here, but we'll be conducting our analysis on each basin individually. So you can see on the screen here, we have 2 basins in northwestern Arizona, the Sacramento Valley Basin and the Hualapai Basin. There are 4 basins in west central Arizona, the Harquahala INA, McMullen Valley Basin, Butler Valley Basin, and the Tiger Wash Basin. And then in southeastern Arizona, we have the brand new Douglas AMA that was just established last week, the Willcox Basin, and the San Bernardino Valley Basin. It was important to us that we select areas for this year that have significant water challenges that are visible in those local communities, where we've already heard discussions from the local stakeholders about their concerns and have also heard substantial feedback from those areas. We wanted to focus this first year on areas outside the AMAs where there's less data, Douglas AMA also, obviously being the exception here. But the establishment of the Douglas AMA last week will eventually provide some reported data that could help us understand the strengths and weaknesses in our estimation methods. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk through a little bit of background information on each basin now. The Hualapai Valley Basin is in northwestern Arizona in Mojave County. The city of Kingman is partially in this basin, but much of the geographic area has in recent history been open desert or rangeland. In the mid-2010s, though, this area began seeing a pretty sudden increase in agricultural acreage, where irrigated agriculture had been pretty minimal prior to that time period. Mojave County sent requests for ADWR to consider designating this basin as an INA, an irrigation non-expansion area, in 2016, 2020, and most recently this past June. ADWR held an informal public meeting there in September, and in October initiated formal proceedings to consider whether to designate the area as an INA. A hearing was held on November 12th, and a decision in this matter will be issued no later than December 19th. Next slide. Sacramento Valley lies southeast of the Hualapai Basin and also includes a portion of the city of Kingman. This basin is also entirely in Mojave County. Both of these basins are almost entirely groundwater dependent, but Sacramento has not seen the same type of expansion in irrigated agriculture in the same way that Hualapai has. The demands in this basin are largely municipal or residential, related to a large mine in the area, related to power production, or related to grazing. Next slide. Moving now to the west central set of basins that we'll be analyzing. The commonality in the next three basins that I'll be talking about is that they are what we refer to as transportation basins. I'm not going to go into the details of the statutory provisions around that here, but the main point is that there are specific statutory provisions allowing groundwater to be moved from the McMullen, Harquahala, and Butler Valley basins and the Big Chino subbasin into an initial active management area. So three of those four basins, McMullen, Harquahala, and Butler, will be a part of our 2023 analysis. This poses a unique supply and demand analysis challenge, as some of the water in storage in these basins will eventually or may eventually be used to meet demands in other basins. And therefore, at that point, that water would be unavailable as a supply in these basins. The Harquahala Basin has portions in Maricopa and La Paz counties and is directly west of the Phoenix AMA. It was designated as an INA in 1982. The basin is largely reliant on groundwater, although there have historically been some small Colorado River water deliveries for agricultural uses in this basin. Most of the demands in this basin are related to irrigated agriculture. Next slide. Thank you. McMullen Valley is north of Harquahala, and its boundaries fall into La Paz, Maricopa, and Yavapai counties. The basin is dependent on groundwater, and the large majority of the water demands in this basin are agricultural. Next, please. Butler Valley is entirely in La Paz County, northwest of McMullen Valley. This basin is also dependent on groundwater with mainly agricultural demands, but the proportion of irrigated acreage in this basin is lower than in Harquahala and in McMullen. The irrigated acreage in this area, though, has frequently been the subject of news reports and public discussion. So, next slide. Tiger Wash is the last basin in this portion of the state and is not a transportation basin like the last three. Tiger Wash is entirely in Maricopa County and is bordered by the Phoenix AMA to the east, McMullen Valley to the north, and Harquahala to the west and south. This basin is reliant on groundwater and appears to have relatively little in terms of groundwater demands. Next slide. Moving now to southeastern Arizona and to our newly established Douglas AMA, which is entirely in Cochise County. Like many of the other basins we've covered, Douglas is groundwater dependent. You'll notice that this map has two boundaries. The inner boundary is the previous boundary of the Douglas INA, Irrigation Non-Expansion Area, which was created as a part of the Groundwater Management Act in 1980. The outer boundary is the full basin boundary and is the boundary of the new AMA, Active Management Area, which was established last week on December 1st, 2022. This means that some of the area in the new AMA and in the basin that we'll be analyzing was previously regulated as an INA, and some of the area was not. Agricultural uses are largely concentrated in the portion of the basin that was previously covered by the INA. This basin includes the city of Douglas, and while the physical boundaries of the basin extend into Mexico, our analysis will include only the portion in Arizona. Next slide, thank you. North of Douglas is the Willcox Basin, which is mostly in Cochise County with a small portion in Graham County. Last month's elections also included a ballot measure to establish an AMA in Willcox, but unlike the measure for Douglas, that ballot measure failed in Willcox. The Willcox Basin has a long history of both irrigated agriculture and ranching, and also contains the city of Willcox and a large dairy. Next slide. Good. Our final basin on the list is San Bernardino Valley, which is located in the southeasternmost corner of the state, east of Douglas, and entirely in Cochise County. With relation to our 2023 set of basins, this basin is most similar to Tiger Wash in that it's groundwater dependent and its demands here are relatively minimal. There's some ranching and a national wildlife refuge in this basin. And like Douglas, our analysis for this basin will be limited to the portion of the basin within the state of Arizona. Next slide. So now that that's out of the way, now that we've talked a little bit about what we're going to analyze this year, I'm going to talk some more about how we are going to do our analysis, how we plan to do this, and some of the challenges that we expect to see in the year ahead. Next slide. All right. So many of you will be familiar with this slide and will notice that it's now updated. We've talked a little bit already about our active management areas, our irrigation non-expansion areas. These are the areas of the state where groundwater use is regulated and where we have specific reported data, where folks are required to submit annual water use reports to ADWR. So we have reported data in these areas that are highlighted, and in the rest of the state, we have to rely on estimates for water use. Next slide. Currently, ADWR compiles historical data on an annual basis. For the AMAs, annual water use reports are compiled by sector, agriculture, municipal, industrial, and then compiled by AMA with artificial recharge and specific wells or hydrologic data. And then this compilation is used to track and analyze things like progress toward a management goal, and is used to update our AMA data dashboards. This AMA data is then added to additional reported and estimated data that is available outside the AMAs. Data reported to ADWR under the community water systems for municipal uses statewide. Data from the Bureau of Reclamation for Colorado River water uses. And estimates created by the USGS for statewide estimates of agricultural uses. All of this data comes together to create an annual statewide water use estimate. Next slide. The statewide water use estimates are used to create graphics and ultimately answer high-level questions like the pieces of information you can see here. This information can be really helpful context and is certainly important, but it's also historical in nature, tracking at a high level what has already happened. It is not basin level, it can't be filtered down to more granular levels, and this does not include any projections. All that is to say, there's a lot for us to build in order for us to get from what we've been doing in the past to where we need to go for this analysis and for the future. Next slide. There have been multiple efforts over the years to analyze Arizona's water supplies and demands. Some looking specifically at the AMAs and some with a more statewide focus. These studies often included projections and different scenarios to help inform our understanding of water supplies and demands in the state and whether we might expect an imbalance in the future. While there certainly were the best of intentions with these reports to maintain and update them over time, the supply and demand assessments that we are talking about now are different in that we have specific statutory requirements to conduct and refresh our analyses at least every 5 years for each basin. And we have specific resources with which to do this work. We see this as a huge opportunity, a big challenge, like I've emphasized already, but also a really significant opportunity to maybe do some things similarly to how they were done in the past, but to also do things differently with an eye to standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. We want to build on the work that has previously been done while restructuring it, updating it, hopefully improving on it, and also developing a path for our own work to be built on and improved upon in the next 5-year cycle and going forward. Next slide. In order to do this analysis, we will be creating basin level water budgets with various scenarios for the components in that budget. At its most basic level, our approach to this analysis will be this. We project supplies, we project demands, and we put the two together to see if they match up or if there's an imbalance. Our goal is for this to be modular so that the various scenarios on either side can be combined in different ways to create a larger number of final budget scenarios. What I mean by this is that you'll have a list of components that you can select from, ag, muni, and industrial scenarios that you can select from, supply scenarios that you can select from, and the specific budget scenario that gets produced will be based on each of those selections coming together. I'm going to note this now, and I'm going to emphasize this in another minute here. This analysis is a basin scale water budget, and it is not a groundwater flow model. Next slide, please. As I said here, our method is a basin scale water budget and projections. We do plan to use the reported data that we do have available to us, but because the basins for this year are largely outside the areas that are required to report, we will also be relying heavily on water use estimates. We plan to use some estimates that we've used in the past. We also plan to reevaluate those past estimates and create new methods for water use estimates in various categories, as well as methods for various projection scenarios. Our final deliverable for this year has a deadline of December 1st, 2023. And at that time, we intend to have published a final assessment report for these basins alongside downloadable data sets and interactive online data tools like the dashboards that we currently have on our AMA webpage. This again is a way of building on the past. building on our experience in the AMAs of developing these dashboards based on the compilation of historic data that occurs each year that I've already talked about. And here, making sure that we're building on this analysis, or building this analysis and these data sets in a way that they can be maintained and updated over time. Next slide. So for all of our excitement and optimism about this process, I do want to temper things a bit also. We have 1 year to do each set of basins and 5 years to do 51 basins. For all the work that was done in the past and all that we are able to build upon, we are still ultimately building a brand new analysis and a brand new process, and this is our first year. It's not going to be perfect. We are going to learn and adjust, and we're going to improve and add complexity over time as time goes on and as this assessment is eventually able to build more clearly upon itself. This is also where I want to emphasize my earlier point that a water budget is not a flow model. While we'll certainly be using GIS tools as a part of our analysis, the end result will be basin scale totals and will not have a finer spatial resolution than that basin scale. So we won't be able to show things like local or non-uniform water level changes. While it would certainly be nice to have a groundwater model for each basin, the time and resources needed to build brand new models simply does not fit in our project timescale of 9 basins this year and 51 basins every 5 years. That all said, we have, you can go to the next slide, please. That all said, we have already been digging into some of the assumptions and considerations that will be necessary in this process. And this is really where we are curious to hear from all of you. In order to create scenarios and apply numbers to some of these squishier concepts, we really have to dig into the vast interconnected web of considerations that is water. So we're thinking about and researching how others have done these types of analyses. How do we define our supply of groundwater or define an imbalance? How do we forecast effluent in the face of changing regulatory structures and changing expected end uses of effluent? How do we incorporate climate change considerations into what we consider to be available supplies for the future? On the demand side, how do we project agricultural uses when that sector has historically been heavily influenced by things like specific markets or development patterns? How do we quantify things like in-stream flows or environmental needs? How can we create forecasts around the impacts of different conservation methods or things like curtailments in a shortage? These are just a few of the things that our team is already working through. We're excited about the progress that we're already making, and we're hopeful about our opportunities to engage subject matter experts on these topics and to engage folks with local knowledge in each basin. And we are super curious to see where the data can take us throughout the course of this year. Next slide. Finally, before we get to our time for questions, I would really like to take this opportunity to brag a little bit about our team. I'm not going to embarrass you guys, don't worry. But I could not be more thrilled with the team that we have been able to put together already for this analysis. We do have 2 additional positions open, so shameless plug here. We are still looking for an agricultural analyst and a water supply analyst, so please send me your resumes. The team we already have, though, is incredibly capable. They are incredibly creative. They already have 1,000 really great ideas about how we can build this and expand this over time. And I personally am really excited to see what they come up with this year. So with that, next slide, please. We'll move on to questions. We've covered a lot of ground here in a pretty short amount of time. So we're happy to flip back to any of the previous slides if that would be helpful. We've got, I see 137 folks on the webinar, so we might have more questions on the webinar. But we're happy to kind of alternate between the folks in the room and the webinar for anyone who has questions. Reminder for folks on the webinar, if you would like to speak, please put your name in the chat or you can type your question into the chat. And for those of you in the room, if you have a question or would like to speak, just raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. For those of you in the room, just a quick reminder, since we do have so many folks on the webinar, please just make sure you speak into the microphone so they can hear you, and also please state your name. And with that, we'll go ahead and take any questions folks might have. Maybe we'll start in the room. Does anyone in the room have any questions? Our few guests. No? Great. Good. And looking to the chat or to the webinar, do we have anyone on the webinar who would like to speak?
See, Pam, go ahead.
Yep, go ahead, Pam.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Hi, Pam.
Hi. So this is awesome, and congratulations on your team. I don't know how many conversations you've had internally yet, but just would like to ask, in the past, DWR has utilized the official statewide population projections. And I was wondering if you've had any conversations about not using those or having that be one scenario, but having other methods of projecting population based on what you really know is going to happen on the ground, projects that are planned, housing units that are planned, other information.
Sure, that's a great question, Pam. And I thought I had our executive order for that open and I've lost it. There we are. So we do actually have a specific executive order that applies to us still. There's an executive order from 2011 that requires state agencies to use the official population data and information from what is now, I think they're under Commerce Authority now. It used to be the State Demographer's Office. So it's a really good question about whether that would be the State Demographer's numbers would be a single projection or one of several scenarios. I'm not totally sure on that specific part of the question, but since that particular executive order is still in effect, we are required to at least use the data that is published by that office.
Thank you.
All right, it looks like we have a few more questions written down in the chat, one of which is from Cheryl Hamlin. How will this data be used to approve, disapprove of projects?
Sure. So that's a great question. I would say as far as the project consideration and criteria, that's really going to be determined by the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority. So I would say that those questions really should be directed to WIFA on how that board and the new board structure will analyze criteria for the projects.
I would just add to that I think it's important that we emphasize that this is on ADWR's side, this is not something that ADWR is going to be using as a regulatory tool. This is specifically an analysis and planning type of exercise on ADWR's side.
All right, we have another question from Tom Sands. When and how can we access a taped version of this presentation? Thank you. And I can actually answer that one. We will be having this presentation as well as the slides available on our public meetings page within the next couple of days, likely by tomorrow.
Thank you, Kevin.
And then we have another question from Cheryl Hamlin. The graph showing water use declining and population increasing appears to intersect. Does this imply there's a possibility for the water use to decline in the future, even with an increasing population, or is the max efficiency point reached?
Sure. Thanks, Cheryl. And the particular slide that she's referring to, I think you know the one, McKenna. Yep. There we go. Thank you. So the particular graph that she's referring to is one that we as an agency use a lot, showing water uses on a statewide level declining right around that 1980 mark when the Arizona Department of Water Resources was created, and also declining over years where both the GDP and the total population of Arizona were increasing really rapidly. It's a good question about efficiency and what we might expect for our water use trends in the future. And I don't necessarily have a hard answer to that today, but those types of questions are certainly things that we hope to evaluate as a part of this analysis and really dig into in the future.
Okay, next question from Greg Crossman. Do you know how you will handle the analysis of subbasins? For example, the large East Salt River Valley Basin has two subbasins, the Carefree Subbasin and the Fountain Hills Subbasin.
It's a really good question, and we don't know yet. So the basins that we are analyzing this year are all just at least by ADWR definitions, none of them have sub-basins. So for this year, everything is going to be based on, like I said earlier, a basin scale analysis. When we get to places, particularly places like the Phoenix AMA that do have existing groundwater models with them, we may reevaluate that approach. But particularly for these basins outside of the AMAs where there's not existing models and particularly where there aren't specific defined subbasins, we'll really be focusing on basin scale totals.
Melinda Whittington asks, I may have missed it, but will the data be visualized? Will the data be visualized with Power BI as it is collected, or will the first analysis be completed and then published with visualizations?
So we will be publishing our data with our initial report. We obviously will be developing preliminary data over the course of the year, but we really want to make sure that that data is really buttoned up and is really what we see as our most reasonable and accurate product at the end of the day. So we don't plan to be publishing draft numbers throughout the year. We'll publish a final report for each of these basins at the end of the year with those types of visualizations.
I'm going to start off by apologizing before I say your last name, but Steve Kissiel, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, asks, he's from the Willcox Basin, and he's sorry if this question has already been covered, as I missed the first part of this meeting due to internet issues. Have you decided which groundwater basins will be included in the 2023 supply and demand presentations? What is the process for deciding the sequence of those assessments?
McKenna, that's slide 11, if you want to go back to that. Thank you. So you can see the slides on the list of basins on your screen. ADWR is establishing a system for deciding which basins we'll be doing in order. I talked a little bit earlier in the presentation about how these initial basins were really decided on the basis of things that we knew were visible water issues around the state. In subsequent years, we haven't established a full 5-year schedule for these analyses. So as we work through this first year of analyses, we'll certainly be considering what our 2024 basins will be, but we haven't specifically defined a process or established what exactly those basins will be for 2024.
No, I agree. And it looks like that also answers the next question. Leslie, about the Big Chino Basin. Yeah, really the focus this year will be on the basins that we've selected. I think as the year progresses, we will have discussions internally about what basins will be included in the following years. And as Natalie pointed out too in her presentation, this first year is really going to be, us figuring out the process, the data sets. Each basin, each analysis, and each year is going to be different from the last because we're going to have different data available as we move through different basins, as we're focusing on areas that have reported data. Obviously, we'll have new data sets to consider. So I think each year we'll just need to be flexible on how we conduct that analysis and basin selection. I think each year will be part of that consideration of how we're going to tee up the next basins for the subsequent years.
Brian Hartman asks, what is the northern boundary of the new Douglas AMA? How close is it to the city of Benson or the I-10?
Thanks, Brian. The city of Benson is outside the Douglas AMA. It's to the west. It's to the north and west of the Douglas Basin. The northern boundary of the Douglas Basin, I believe Elfrida is somewhere kind of in the general vicinity of the boundary of that basin. We do have clearer maps on our website specifically for the Douglas Basin. And like I said, with interactive data tools and that kind of thing, we do plan to have some map tools available for these basins. Specific questions about the Douglas AMA, we do have a Douglas AMA website set up that you can get to from our AMA webpage. And for the I-10, Brian, the I-10 actually passes through the city of Willcox, so the I-10 is a decent ways north of where the boundary of the Douglas Basin is. I forget exactly how far, but it's quite a ways south of the 10.
Yeah.
Cheryl Hamlin asks, transportation AMA, does this mean the water is physically moved or is it an accounting entry? If physical, how is this accomplished?
Good question. So for the transportation basins, that is a reference to the water being physically moved. In most cases, what has been contemplated is that water might be pumped in one of those transportation basins and put in a pipeline or maybe existing infrastructure like the CAP Canal, and physically moved into an initial AMA. So it is a physical movement that is being contemplated by those statutory provisions.
Cheryl Hamlin also asked, how will the effluent forecast collect data? Will the large wastewater systems be providing data for this study? What is the cutoff in size?
That is a great question and is something we are working to consider right now. We actually have been having a lot of conversations about effluent over the last couple of weeks. So I don't know yet. I guess is the answer to that question. We're certainly going to consider things like information that we might be able to obtain from ADQ or other public entities that might have additional data that we might not have about these types of things. And we're certainly going to be looking at the influence of things like population on effluent forecasts. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one to be exploring over time. Yeah, I don't know yet. Any other questions?
Tim Flood asks, how will ADWR's work in the 51 subbasins affect the work on the 22 planning areas?
Yeah, so good question. The 22 planning areas were actually part of the original Arizona Water Initiative, I think back from 2016 through 2018. In 2019, there was actually a new executive order from the governor focusing that Arizona Water Initiative effort more on the Governor's Water Council and kind of not necessarily on the 22 planning areas. So every groundwater basin within those 22 planning areas will be part of this analysis. So essentially, we will be conducting an assessment within the planning areas, but we're focusing this more in the statutory language now from the current legislation is to focus on the groundwater basins in the state. So I hope that answers your question. And I also wanted to give a call out. Do we have anybody on the phone participating who wants to provide any comments or questions? I always forget that part. I don't see anybody. Okay.
Another call out for any questions from the room? Nada? Good. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. I'm getting the head shake from Kevin in the back. Good. All right.
We can both close the meeting together. Yeah, so I thank you for attending, and I really appreciate the questions. If there are more questions as we're going through this process, don't hesitate to contact Natalie or I. We're hopefully going to be working together with the programs at ADWR, but we also will be probably reaching out to some of you folks for some feedback as well. So yeah, if there's any questions, our contact information is shown here. Our contact info is on the website, and then we'll have this presentation posted here shortly. I'm missing anything?
I don't think so. We're really grateful for all of you that have taken the time to show interest in this process. We're really excited to be digging into this challenging work that we see as something that is going to end up being really valuable for the state. So we just want to thank you all for your time and engagement, and we look forward to working with a lot of the folks in the room and also on the webinar today as we work through this process. So thank you. Great. And I think with that, we're adjourned.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.